Okay, we're going to get started. I would like to thank everyone for joining the second session of our Lenses on Inclusion. We're very excited to have all of you with us today. Presenting is my dear friend, Christine Lowry. She is Montessori credentialed in special education with ME2 master's degrees in special education. For birth to age 21. I've known her since I started working here at MACD 12 years ago. She is very experienced and serving a wide range of diversity and disability in a very variety of settings, including 2 inclusive Montessori programs, which she founded, directed, and has taught in. She is well known for her engaging workshops and courses, which we are so pleased to have her with us today. Her talks are firmly rooted in Montessori philosophy and pedagogy and are consistent with current research. They're evidence-based. And she'll be talking about trends in special education for inclusion. So let's all welcome Christine Lowry. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm very, very delighted to be here and really looking forward to spending the next hour and a half chatting and sharing some information. We do have a Q&A icon that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions, you have thoughts, comments that you would like to make, please put those in the Q&A. And we will have 2 specific periods in the presentation for responding to questions. Rebecca is going to be monitoring the Q&A for us. So if there is a question that absolutely has to be answered right now, this moment, then Rebecca will just let us know that that's the case, and we'll stop and we'll address that, and then we'll return to the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. Okay, so Montessori, a model for inclusive education. The goals that I have for you for today, and I hope that these are accomplished in the short amount of time that we have. This is very much an overview of inclusive education in today's world. But I hope that you get a good sense of what it is and how it works in a Montessori classroom. And more importantly, for those of you who are school leaders, teacher trainers, coaches, I'm hoping that you will get some bit of information and some thoughts and ideas mostly about how we can guide and support Montessori educators to be successful, inclusive Montessori educators. So I'd like to start by inviting you to reflect. As you think about your teacher education program in your schools and in your classrooms, some of you might be currently educating in classrooms, I want you to think about what it was that brought you to Montessori. It has a way of kind of hooking a lot of us in. What was that did it for you? What keeps you in Montessori? Particularly, many of us, our roles have changed over our career in Montessori, our life in Montessori. So think about also what's been your lived experience as a Montessorian. And while you're reflecting on your own, I'd like to share just a little bit about my story. I was a special educator before I had vaguely heard about Montessori, but really didn't know much about it at all. But I'd been a special educator in a variety of settings, from psychiatric hospitals, day treatment programs, public school programs, small private schools. I also, for most of that time, was in a practice with a clinical psychologist. We worked with students of all ages, we worked with their families, and part of my role as the therapeutic educator, as part of that clinical practice, was to go into schools and help classroom teachers understand how they could best support the students and how we could collaborate on the work that I was doing with the students and the family and how they could follow through with that in the classroom. And then, like many of you, as a parent, I observed in a Montessori classroom. And I was instantly impressed with how perfect a fit it could be for all kinds of students. It was then, after doing a lot of reading, after substituting in that classroom and in that school and learning more and more and more about Montessori, I made the leap to get my Montessori credential with the intention of founding an inclusive Montessori school. I had been working with younger children as well as adolescents, and I saw a lot of the pain that families went through, the struggle that they went through, the struggle that students went through in knowing that they were having difficulty, but not knowing why, and not having anybody there to guide and support them. And my feeling was, if I started an inclusive school, starting with early childhood, that a lot of that could be avoided. And I could just do the things that I knew how to do and combine those and align them with Montessori education. And so inclusive school number 1 was opened. And over the years that I directed, worked with some amazing, wonderful teachers in that school, my lived experience was to really have that idea reinforced that Montessori is a wonderful model for working with all kinds of students. And over the years, I saw the benefits, I saw the values for all students that I was working with. There was a degree of respect and acceptance of one another. There was an understanding that we all have strengths and that we all have challenges. And to see the ways that children wanted to help one another with those was just so gratifying and clearly something that could happen in a Montessori classroom. So I want to talk a little bit about what I lovingly refer to as today's children. We know that Dr. Montessori talked about children absorbing the society in which they're living. Our students today have been living in a very, very different kind of society than many of us who started teaching 20, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, right? So a few statistics here, and I do want to pause and say, when I use the word children, I'm referring to everybody birthed through age 18, okay? To me, they're all kind of children. So no disrespect intended for young people and adolescents, okay? But for the sake of today, I'm going to call them children. So we know that in the 2019-2020 school year, 14.1% of students aged 3 to 21 had IEPs, individual education plans, which meant that those students had been identified as having a significant enough struggle with behavior and or learning that they went through a very rigorous evaluation process. They went through a process of having a team of people, including their parents, who were able to collaborate and come up with goals and a plan for supporting these students. What I really want you to pay attention to is this is up from, it was 11% in the year 2000. So in not too very many years, it changed significantly. 17% of students 3 to 17 years of age were identified as having a developmental delay. This is a statistic from the Center for Disease Control. So this is a little bit more recent. This actual statistic, I think, is from a year or two ago, but it was revised and updated on their website in 2021. But what we know is that during this time, and again, in the 2019-20 school year, almost 67% of all students aged 6 to 21 spent 80% or better of their time in the general education classroom, receiving services and supports in the general education classrooms. Now, we're starting to get more data over the past 18, 24 months that this has been going on, we're seeing an increase in adverse childhood experiences. Those of you who are familiar with trauma-informed classrooms and education will be familiar with that term ACE. It's generally accepted that over the past 24 months, we have all been experiencing collective trauma. And if you look at the definition of collective trauma, you will see that one of those big events that results in collective trauma is a pandemic. So we are all experiencing this. We are seeing a definite increase in developmental delays, particularly in our younger children, and particularly in the areas of speech and language development, social skills, motor skills. When you receive the reference and resources list from my presentation, you will see a lengthy but quite comprehensive article from the American Association of Pediatricians that has a lot of data about what we're finding out of the impacts on the pandemic on children. We've also seen an increase in sensory processing difficulties with our children. So what I'm hearing from teachers and from school leaders all the time is that we're seeing an increase in behavior challenges. We're seeing children who don't want to engage in work. They don't want to work independently. They just want to talk with their friends all of the time. Their attention and their concentration is just not what we would expect. And by this time in the school year, we're definitely seeing an impact on normalization. Our classrooms are just not normalizing. Individual children just don't seem to be normalizing on the same time frame that we have seen in the past. So let's talk a little bit about inclusion and how it can support all of what we are seeing in today's children. Inclusion is a philosophy, it's a framework, and it's a practice. It's a philosophy and a really understanding and a respect for diversity. The belief that children belong and all children can belong and benefit from one another. It's a framework in that inclusion has a structure or an organization at the classroom and the school level. There are different kinds of structure and different kinds of organization that can be specifically aligned with a particular school. The size of the school, is it public, is it private? Is it Montessori? And we have a body of knowledge over the past 30 years that helps us get a better understanding of this. But inclusion is also a practice. It's the knowledge and strategies put into action by a collaborative team of the child's family, the classroom teachers, the support services individuals as needed. And inclusion, and this is one of the most important things that I'd like you to get from today. Inclusion means all children. It's not just about children who have been identified as having a disability, not just children who have IEPs. Inclusion is really meant to be a practice, a framework, and a philosophy for working with all students in the classroom. Inclusive classrooms really are about how do we provide those equitable opportunities for everyone. The generally accepted definition that has evolved over the past 30 years, but is pretty firmly rooted in today's understanding of what inclusive education means, is that it is for all students. It's not a matter of categorizing typical versus atypical learners or neurotypical or neuroatypical learners. What we're really looking at from a Montessori perspective is how do we guide each student toward their self-construction, as Dr. Montessori referred to it. So as Montessori guides and as educators, we want every child to have full access to the classroom, to each area of the curriculum. We want all of our students to be able to fully participate with the supports that they need in the general education classroom as much as possible. And most important at all, we want students to have a sense of belonging, that they are an important member of a classroom community, and that within that, they can thrive. I want to share this quote with you because I just think it's such a powerful quote and really gets at the heart of what inclusion is. The value of diversity within the human community. When inclusive education is fully embraced, we abandon the idea that children have to become normal in order to contribute to the world. We begin to look beyond typical ways of becoming valued members of the community, and in doing so, begin to realize the achievable goal of providing all children with an authentic sense of belonging. Now, I want you to peek at the reference here on this page. This quote was written in 1992. We're not talking about a recent phenomena. We're talking about an increasing phenomena in education, and this is the dominant trend in education today. So when we're talking about the philosophy of inclusion, what we're really talking about in today's model is a social model of disability. Disability that is a result of obstacles, either environmental obstacles, obstacles in people's attitude towards diversity, and the lack of supports that are needed in order to have full access and full participation. We know that there are differences in ability, and it's one more form of diversity. It's a natural and normal part of the human genome. Now, I'd like to briefly mention that there are many members of the disability community who really get to choose what language they would like when they're being referred to. Some people would like to be called autistic individuals. Some people would prefer to be a person with autism. Some people prefer to be referred to as having a disability. But all people want to belong, and all people want to be accepted. And that's really what we're talking about with the philosophy of inclusion. The philosophy of inclusion is based on a strength-based versus a deficit-based model of seeing students. When we support and accommodate, we can design learning environments that are welcoming to all students. We reframe what might look like a challenge and reframe it so that we're not defining a student by their challenge. Think for a moment about what one of your challenges might be. We all have them, right? And let's say you were introduced to a group of people based on your challenge. Oh, I'm happy to introduce you to Christine Lowry. She can be really impatient sometimes. That's their first impression of me, is that I can be impatient all the time. Yes, I can, but there's lots of other things that I can be as well that are based on my strengths. So for example, let's say we have a student in an upper elementary classroom who has a tendency to call out a lot, to interrupt a lot, to share their thoughts. Reframing that would be thinking, this student has some really great ideas and is so eager and motivated to contribute to the conversation that we're having. How can I, as the classroom teacher, provide that student with the structure that they need to be able to freely express their feelings and their ideas in a way that works for everybody? So that's a really important part of inclusive education, is this reframing. We know that inclusive education is of real value and benefit to all students, and we've got 30 years of research that's backing this up. We're seeing an increase in academic achievement for all students. That worry that I hear of, oh, if I'm attending to this one, then I'm ignoring the others, that's a myth. It means that we need the knowledge and the skills to know how to organize it, okay? But all children achieve at a higher academic level in an inclusive classroom. We see an increase in social emotional skills. We see an increase in respect for one another's strengths and one another's challenges. And in a philosophy of education that sees mistakes as an opportunity, which has now become part of mainstream education, it's important that we all realize we have challenges and we all have strengths that we can bring. All children feel a sense of belonging. So there's increased motivation. There's a decrease in behavior challenges in many cases. It means that students are supporting and helping one another, and that teacher expectations tend to be higher for every student in the classroom. We have a concurrent body of research that shows that removing children from the general education classroom, as has been done in special education for way too many years now, pull out is what it's referred to, you may have heard that, that doing that indicates a decreased academic achievement in those students who are pulled out. There's a delay in social skills in students who are pulled out. They don't feel a sense of belonging to the community because they don't have the same opportunities to engage and interact and play and learn from a wide range of human beings. We also see a decrease in long-term school success and post-graduation success in jobs and in life. As I said, inclusion is the dominant trend in schools, in districts, and in state policies. So let's look for a moment at the roots of inclusion in US education law. For those of you who are joining us from elsewhere in the world, I will apologize right up front. My area of expertise is education law in the United States. But I dare say that in countries around the world, there is similar kind of legislation that supports all kinds of learners. So the first real education act that we had in the United States was way back in 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. What was important about this is that for the first time, it recognized that children considered to be handicapped back in those days, right? That was the language that was used, were not just their parents' responsibility. That we are now looking at this idea that public schools have something to do with educating and supporting, and public, the ADA Act was passed slightly after this, that Catherine talked about last week. It meant that public money was now being put into teacher education to teach special educators how to work with a wide range of students. It meant that public money was being put into starting special education programs in our public schools. That was followed quite a bit after 2004 by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, as it's known. And I will say that it is in desperate need of reauthorization. And the Council for Exceptional Children has been advocating quite strongly to get IDEA reauthorized and rewritten and really look at some of the language that's in there and update it with our current body of research and knowledge. But the two important things that I want you to get from this particular act is that it introduced the idea of a free, appropriate public education for all students. This was a new idea at this time. It also introduced the idea of least restrictive environment. This is the absolute legal foundation to inclusion, because the law says something to the effect, I'm not directly quoting, but that each child, to the greatest extent possible, will be educated in the general education environment with differentiated instruction based on the universal design for learning that I can tell you more about if you're interested in learning about that. But it's really about a learning design that provides accessibility to the curriculum to all students in that classroom. This grew out of the universal design movement that actually started at North Carolina State University down the road from where I am, that grew out of the physical disabilities advocacy movement, of realizing that how many buildings have stairs with no elevator and no ramp. And that then became a model for how do we include students in the education with a design for learning that supports their learning. In 2015, we got the Every Student Succeeds Act. This is a reauthorization of No Child Left Behind. And what is really important in terms of inclusion about this act is that it introduced the idea of multi-tiered systems of support. Now, briefly, many of you may be familiar with that already. It is a generally three-tiered system of support for all students in general education classrooms. It integrates academic and behavioral, social, emotional needs for all students. So we no longer have RTI, response to intervention, or positive behavior intervention support plans. We have MTSS, multi-tiered system of support. The explicit focus of MTSS is on preventative measures rather than remediation. It means including a universal screening tool at Tier 1 for every student, so that we immediately have an idea of those students who may have significant disabilities that require immediate attention. We know how important early intervention is, particularly for our younger students. So MTSS built in the need for universal screening. But basically it works with Tier 1 being universal best practices in education based on today's research for everybody. And then we identify a target group of students, a subgroup of students who need more targeted instruction and supports. And then we have Tier 3 that might be for very few students in the classroom who really need that intense intervention to help them have full access and full participation. MTSS specifically states that it's this system, this tiered system of support, can be used in part to determine the validity of a referral to special education. And that comes from this screening. So we're not leaving out children that might need real intense support services in the classroom or elsewhere, but typically, as I showed you in that statistic, typically happening in the general education classroom. So example, we have a student in the classroom who has sensory processing challenges. Many of them do. And there is an occupational therapist at the school. Public schools are mandated to have a special education staff and usually support services such as an occupational therapist, speech and language therapist, usually a behavioral interventionist, maybe a school psychologist, depends on the school, the size, the district. But in this example, that OT might go into the classroom and provide what we call push-in services for that child identified with sensory processing challenge. But while in the classroom, might work with several other children that have similar issues but have not been identified. And that's what support services can look like in an inclusive classroom. That OT also would be providing consultation, coaching, mentoring to the classroom teacher in building his or her capacity to work with the number of children in the classroom that might have sensory processing challenges. So it's kind of a win-win for everybody. MTSS is mandated for all states and all districts, public and charter schools. It was intended to be fully implemented by 2019. I know that it hasn't been fully implemented everywhere, but it's on the way. But what's really incredible about MTSS is that it's a wonderful framework. It's not a program, it's a framework. It's a way of organizing and looking at how we support all students. So it makes a wonderful framework for private schools. And I have helped private Montessori schools develop an MTSS that's customized with the framework that works for the size of their school, the age range that they serve in their school, the staff that they have. And it works quite nicely with Montessori. We have roots of inclusion in the neurosciences. Now, I'm going to let you just kind of read this while I'm sharing with you the resource on this page, and it will also be on the resource page that you'll get when you get the recording. This is from Julia Volkman, who's with Maitri Montessori. She also is a neuroscientist who works for Harvard and is Montessori credentialed. She has a wonderful video on the Maitri site. The website is listed here, that really aligns Montessori best practice based on Dr. Montessori's observations as the scientist that she was, and today's neuroscience. So we know, and it's in large part why we have inclusive education. Every person's brain is different. We are all unique. Yes, we have lots and lots of similarities, but we are all unique based on our genetics and our lived experience. Neuroscience has shown that learning does in fact require a repetition. Yep, Dr. Montessori knew that. That executive functioning develops over a much longer period of time than we thought at one time. You know, up into the mid-30s, and for some of us, I would dare say beyond that. I think it would be wonderful if Dr. Montessori had been able to write about the fifth plane of development past the age of 24. I wonder what she would have thought about that. We know that we all learn through relationships, and particularly as a result of the pandemic, when children are desperately, desperately needing connection and a sense of feeling emotionally safe in a classroom. We know that learning and motivation depend in large part on what it is we're learning. Is it something we're interested in? Is it something that we're ready to learn? And we know, yes, that the environment matters, the prepared environment. We can also look to the cognitive sciences to give us some information about inclusion. The science of learning that helps us learn how to best teach children and adults. But we also have adult learning theories. For those of us who work with adults, this can be very, very helpful information in how do we guide and educate adults, and how is that different than educating children? So if you're a school leader, if you are a teacher educator, if you're a coach, a consultant, this can be really, really helpful in understanding who our adult learners are today and how to provide a format that works best for them. The last 15 years, we've gotten lots of information about the science of reading. And what we have found out specifically from the science of reading is that a framework that's known as structured literacy, 3 principles of teaching, 6 components of reading and literacy, is the best evidence-based practice for working with all students. The idea began with looking at students with dyslexia. But over the years of research, we have found that it is actually the best way of teaching reading to all students. I will say that many of you are familiar with Orton Gillingham. Orton Gillingham uses a structured literacy framework. but it is only one program that uses a structured literacy framework, and none of them have been shown to be better than any of the others. So there's Wilson, there's Linda Mood Bell, there's a number of them. Montessori scope and sequence of language and literacy and the Montessori materials can be very well aligned to structured literacy. It's in fact one of the courses that I've been teaching that's been very, very popular. We also, though, know a lot about the science of inclusion, and I shared some of that with you. So I'm going to take a moment here to pause and ask you, what kinds of questions and thoughts do you have so far? Does this make sense? Do you see how it might align with Montessori philosophy and with the way that we teach in Montessori? I'm curious how many of you might be seeing inclusive philosophy in practice in the classrooms in your schools or in those that you're observing with your adult learners. Rebecca, do we have some questions that we can engage with?
This time, Christine, there are no questions.
Oh my goodness, okay.
I did send you something in your chat, if you could quickly look at that.
Oh, okay, I will do that. Okay. Okay, the answer to the question is no. If I sit back a little bit further, does that help? Does that help? Is that better now?
No, it's still the same. It's a little bit of an echo. I'm not sure. Are you using your computer microphone?
I am, yes. Yes.
It's not terrible. It's just there's a little bit of feedback. Okay, we've got some questions coming in.
Okay. I was going to say, either I've completely blown you away and you can't even think about questions.
No. I think that people are utterly engaged in
Right. Yes, no, I know. I'm
so here's a question.
Okay.
What is the general attitude and perception of Montessori teachers towards inclusion? Is there a specific Montessori model of inclusion for all Montessorians?
Let me answer the second part first. In the same way that there's not a specific model of Montessori for all classrooms in all schools, Montessori is a philosophy and a pedagogy, right? No, there's no particular specific model that's going to work for every Montessori school. There isn't a prescription. There isn't a program for how to do this. It is looking at the philosophy. It's looking at the various kinds of frameworks and models of inclusion, deciding which one is best for your school, and then looking at what are the practices. Now, in terms of Montessori teachers' attitudes towards inclusion, there isn't a lot done, but many of you may be familiar with Dr. Natalie Danner, who works at the University of Illinois. Natalie is a Montessori credentialed teacher. She also has a PhD in early childhood education. And for her dissertation in 2014 or 15, she actually looked at that question and she surveyed non-Montessori general education teachers as well as Montessori general education teachers. And what she found was that both groups supported the idea of inclusion in principle. Of course, we want to serve and support all students. The difference that she found was that many of the general education teachers who had gone through university programs to become certified teachers in their state, many of them had been required to have at least one class in exceptional children or special education. Whereas the Montessori teachers felt like they just didn't have that body of experience. And so, though both groups really felt like there was much more that they needed to learn, more specifics that they needed to learn about strategies and that kind of thing, that was the biggest concern of the Montessori teachers who had not gone through a general education certification program.
Okay, do you want to take one more before you start again?
Sure.
Okay, so Gulzevin asks, how would you approach teachers who think they are inclusive, but in reality they are not?
How long have you got for an answer? Then what we do know outside of the world of Montessori, but in the general world of education research, the number one biggest obstacle to inclusion is teacher mindset and attitude. And so that whole idea of how do we help teachers understand what this is? How do we help teachers understand the benefits and the value of what it is? And having worked with a number of schools and a number of educators, I will say that I think what's underneath that is some fear that I don't have the knowledge to know how to do it. So it's universally accepted that teachers of all pedagogies need more knowledge. They need specific professional development. And we're going to get to that a little bit towards the end of what kinds of professional development and information can we help our Montessori teachers get. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, we have a lot coming in, so you tell me when you want to pause.
Okay, well, let me go through the rest of this and then we'll see. I'll try to
come back to these. Okay.
I'll make a longer amount of time at the end. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sorry about the echo, but okay. So Montessori is a wonderful model for inclusion as long as we are blending our prior knowledge as Montessorians with our current knowledge. Okay. So I want us to start with what's familiar, our prior knowledge. We know about the triad, right? Dr. Montessori said the adult, the child, and the environment are a trinity, and they have to be considered as one. I want us to think about the dynamic interplay of these three. We're starting with a child, let's say, okay? And how do we think about that child and how do we observe that child so that we can help prepare an environment that works for that child? Because what we know is if it works for one, it's going to work for all. So it's a slightly different take on our triad understanding, but it's still about really identifying the interest and the readiness and the strengths and challenges of each of our students so that we can adjust how we have a relationship with each and how we prepare an inclusive environment. So let's start with the prepared adult. The first step an intending Montessori teacher must take is to prepare herself, right? This is that question that you just asked. Thank you. We need to get to the place where we can accept diversity and accept its value to a Montessori classroom. It means that we need to be open to learning and engaging and being okay with making some mistakes, being okay with feeling a little uncomfortable that maybe we don't know how to do something or that we don't have all of the answers. You know, and I will tell you, I mean, I've been involved in Montessori and special education for a very long time. And I have no doubt that if I walked into a Montessori classroom to teach in it tomorrow, that there would be a child in there that I would have to be open to learning from. And, you know, one of the beauties of Montessori, right? We learn from the children as well as they learn from us, we hope, or maybe we learn more from them. It means that we have to think about working as a collaborative team. We are not just a silo in our classroom with us and our teaching associate or assistant or whatever that person is called, that crucially important other adult in the classroom. It means that now we are partnering with parents. We're partnering with support service people. We are partnering with community resources if we're a small private school and we don't have an OT and we don't have a physical therapist or a speech and language pathologist on our staff. We still can work with those people. I think the most important thing, and really one of the things that I find delightful about Montessori education, is how do we stay in touch with that curiosity of learning? how can I best teach each child? It's that attitude that we want to help our teachers in training and our current teachers begin to cultivate in themselves. When we're talking about the prepared environment, the cure for difficult children must be to provide a free life for them, to prepare an environment. Dr. Montessori is not talking about the free-for-all that too many people still think is true of Montessori classrooms. It's the freedom with structure, and that freedom with structure is the prepared environment, right? So I like to think of an inclusive prepared environment as having three components. Yes, it's the physical design of the classroom, but it's also the social emotional design of the classroom and how we are intentionally attending to that. And then looking at the instructional design beyond the, I know how to give a presentation with name a material, any material. Do I know how to vary that presentation to work with a given student? So when we're talking about the physical environment, I think for today's children, we're really talking about less is more. We know that children have a great need to move, and they need permission to be able to do that. That's how they learn. And we know that as Montessorians, but it's even more important for today's children, particularly as we see increases in a need for more sensory input that many, many children get from being able to move. I think that we need to really look at having an emphasis on the Montessori materials because we know how wonderfully they work. We can adjust how they're working for a particular child, adjust how we're presenting to a particular child. But we also need to really intentionally think about how we're reducing what feels like to many of our students visual and auditory clutter. They just can't handle it. They're bombarded. We are all bombarded all of the time. How can we make our classrooms a place of calm and peace? And one way to do that is to narrow down the visual and the auditory field, if you will. It means that we're intentionally providing spaces for individual children to work because we know that we've got children that have difficulty with attention and concentration. So let's give them a place that helps support them with that by having their own space to work in. It means that we're doing more small group work, and particularly now as we have students who want to work with each other, not alone. It means that we are really attending to keeping our curriculum and the materials and the activities that we have available responsive to the interests and the readiness of the students. I know many of us were taught that you have everything out at the very, very beginning of the year and it's out all year. You know, that may have been the case when we had children who stayed for 3 years, who we didn't have a lot of new children coming in each year. We didn't have children who were living in America or elsewhere in 2022. We can keep that dynamic movement of what we have available for children, okay? When we're looking at the social emotional environment, this is a huge piece and a huge need for Montessorians. It means that we have to really have a more intentional sense of providing emotional safety with predictability and consistency. All of this I have put under the umbrella of responsive guidance. That's a term that I have come up with because we're guides. We want to guide children in response to what they need so that we're serving and supporting those children. We know that today's children need greater predictability and consistency. So how do we intentionally plan routines? How do we intentionally plan transitions? And how do we teach those? And how do we provide repetition and practice throughout the entire school year? Because we know that we've got some children that are going to learn it once. We've also got some children it's going to take 47 times before they learn it. And our job is to be responsive in guiding them with patience, okay? It means that we're teaching social emotional skills. This has been a huge emphasis in the general world of education, particularly over the past 2 years, and particularly in early childhood education, which in the broader world of education includes students 0 to age 8. Okay, so that's a difference between the use of that term in Montessori and general education. This goes way beyond grace and courtesy. This includes teaching children self-awareness. It means teaching self-management skills, working on executive functioning in a way that helps students able to manage their emotions and challenges that come up and conflicts that come up. They have to be able to manage themselves before they can then move to relationship management. But in between there, there's social awareness. So self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship management. And relationship management is really where grace and courtesy comes in, because grace and courtesy lessons are teaching a group of children how to get along in community, right? They have to have awareness of themselves. They have to have some ability to manage themselves. And they're I don't like the term impulses, but for the sake of now, impulses, that they understand their impact on other people. And then how can they adjust what they're doing to manage their relationships with one another? And that's when we get into how do we help children learn to negotiate and compromise and mediate conflicts. It means that we're using a philosophy, a mindset, an attitude of prevention to guide towards positive behavior rather than responding and more like reacting to negative behavior. Obviously, if a child is engaged in something that's not safe, we're going to respond to that. But if we respond to that in a way that is also teaching a positive way of getting whatever that behavior needs, then we're giving that student some long-term tools and skills for interacting in the classroom. We're also talking about intentionally, explicitly creating a community of belonging and acceptance, because that sense of belonging is absolutely so crucial and so important. Dr. Montessori said in one of her lectures that she gave in London in 1946, the society of cohesion is characteristic of little children, for they are naturally full of love and sympathy and help for others. And yes, they are, but in today's world, how do we explicitly give them opportunities to engage in what is natural for them? The instructional environment, we're really looking at how do we differentiate instruction. Many people have heard that term and heard the term scaffolding, and they think they know what it means, but it means much, much more than I find most people think that it means. It means using universal design for learning, which is a way of looking at what is the content we want to teach, what is the process for teaching it, and how is this student going to demonstrate that they have learned through that process. It's individual, it's small group, but it's basically based on the strengths of the individual. It means that we're learning strategies for presentations that might be different than what we learned in training. We had to get that good base of this is the ideal lesson in our teacher education programs. But now we have the confidence and the competence and more tools and knowledge and strategies to know how to intentionally vary that to meet the needs of our individual learners who have a wide range of learning ability, right? Scaffolding means what are the prompts that we can use? What are the accommodations and modifications that we could use for all students, not just students who have an IEP or are identified as having a disability, but for any student. And more importantly, how do we adjust those as they're no longer needed by the student? Too much help is a hindrance, right? So these are some things that we can help our Montessori adults learn. We need to have tools for progress monitoring. How do we know if what we're doing is working? And if we have that lens of preventative and support for all students, we want to know that we are in fact supporting every student in our classroom. So today's children need today's teachers. And today's teachers need more knowledge, more understanding, specific strategies and that mindset of scientific pedagogy. So the way I like to think of this is we start again with our prior knowledge. We've got so much wonderful knowledge and such an incredible foundation. We can return to our roots as taught by Dr. Montessori's philosophy and pedagogy. We can understand the human tendencies, which haven't changed. It's how we help children meet those needs of human tendencies that might have changed. We combine that with current knowledge of these areas that we've talked about. And then we bring those together to develop a diversity mindset with the structure of inclusion, with the practice of inclusion, and the ability to collaborate with the variety of people that are going to be available to help support all of our students. So what we're really talking about is how do we reframe and reorganize the work that we do with Montessori adults? I hear people often say, we can't add in really very much of this at all to our teacher education program because we've got so much already, we don't have time to add anything else. So what I would like you to really think about is, how can we reorganize what we're doing in our teacher education programs? How do we reorganize what we're doing in the way we're supporting our staff and our faculty in our Montessori schools? How do we incorporate this new knowledge into our current curriculum? And for instance, when we're looking at universal design for learning, it would not be difficult at all to include some of that information once teachers had the general framework, which they could get in an hour or two, to incorporate that knowledge in variations and extensions of a lesson. Would be one way to do that, okay? It means that we're reorganizing our albums basically. And yet, you know, we still have our albums. We don't have to throw away the album and start over. It's what we're just adding a little bit to it. And we're helping our students understand how this is going to be used in their classrooms. It means, I feel very strongly about this. So, you know, there's lots of different ideas. This is my opinion, but I think we really have to think this idea of classroom management. Classrooms are not a corporation, and we're not managing a group of students. We're not disciplining a group of students. Those words, management and discipline, connected with children, have taken on a negative connotation. And so I prefer the term responsive guidance, because we are guides of children. We're guides to the whole child. And we want our guidance to be responsive to the needs of each child so that that child can learn how to get along and belong with tools of support, with using some of the tiered level supports that we can have with an MTSS. It means that we look at the way we teach observation and assessment and record keeping to our adults. I like to think of going beyond the observation that we teach now to include inquiry observation. When we have a concern about a particular student, how do we start by generating questions that we have about that student? And those questions can guide our pinpointed observation, and that pinpointed observation can help us understand what is it that student needs for support. With assessment, we can use formative assessment tools that are looking at each student's base of knowledge. What does that student know, and where does that student's instruction need to begin? I'm not talking about summative, you know, state mandated. Yeah, if you're in public school, yeah, you have to do some of that. But in terms of what do we know what to teach, there are formative assessments that we use. Some of it observation, some of it might be more checklists. But record keeping for inclusion means essentially progress monitoring. How do we know that what we're doing is working? I know a lot of Montessorians don't like the word data, but honestly, we need data to know that what we're doing is supporting. It's not just throwing stuff out there and see if it sticks. It's knowing that it sticks. That's I feel, our obligation to our students. If you are working in a teacher education program, I encourage you to really think about how you can remodel the practicum, because really, no matter what classroom your adult learners are doing an internship in, or doing more likely a self-directed internship, they're going to have an inclusive classroom. By default, it is what's happening in education, in classrooms. They need the guidance, they need the help, they need the strategies. And that means that teacher trainers need to gain some of that knowledge too. So this is an opportunity for all of us to reframe our own learning, to reorganize how we teach and what we teach, so that we can be the best Montessori teachers possible for today's children. We're following in Dr. Montessori's footsteps. Dr. Montessori was first and foremost a scientist. She called her system of education scientific pedagogy, right? That means that we can gain knowledge. We can enrich our understanding based on our curiosity and our open mind. And really, what does it mean to live as a Montessorian? That philosophy of educating the whole child for peace, for calm, right? It means that lifelong learner isn't just a tagline. It means that we're helping students be excited about learning, but are we modeling that by being lifelong learners ourselves? Okay, so I did it, Rebecca. We've got 30 minutes to engage in questions.
Thank you, Christine. Let me go back to, I think you've answered some of the questions that came through.
Okay.
But let me go back to Kristen. She asked a question. She said, I'm curious your thoughts on RTL process.
RTI.
RTI, okay.
Yes.
And how it aligns or doesn't to Montessori education. She says, I understand providing students with additional support, but tier 2 interventions in particular feel uncomfortably traditional. And she says that she's a public school teacher.
That was going to be my question. There is a misunderstanding oftentimes in what is meant by tier 2 and tier 3 supports. RTI was specifically omitted from the Every Student Succeeds Act. We're not using RTI anymore. We shouldn't be. For those of you who don't know, RTI is response to intervention. And it was based on a timeline where we provide an intervention for a student that needs remediation for X amount of time. And then we see if the child is doing better with that short, usually, I mean, I've seen as short as 6 weeks. 6 weeks amount of time intervention. Now is the child, everything's fine. And that's not really an accurate current understanding. And yes, I agree with you. I don't think that it aligns particularly well with Montessori education. What we really mean by tier 2 supports is a targeted instruction, okay? And it could be a targeted intervention for behavior or learning, or usually both, that student receives for the length of time that that student needs to receive it. I've also heard some schools refer to children as tier 2 or tier 3 children. That is absolutely incorrect. It's the supports that we offer that are at tier 2 or tier 3, and they are not specific supports. They are specific to the intensity of the intervention. So let's say, for instance, that you've got a student who is in a public school classroom, an elementary classroom, is not meeting the benchmark assessments for reading. And So it's agreed that this student needs more targeted instruction in a particular area of reading, okay? And so we're going to give that student those particular supports in reading instruction that that student needs. And we're going to keep an eye on how that student is progressing. And maybe the plan is going to be that the student is going to get that kind of supported instruction, maybe 15 minutes a day, 5 days a week or 4 days a week, okay? And then we notice over a period of time that the student really doesn't seem to be moving past that. So now we're thinking maybe this child needs more intensive intervention. So rather than getting that targeted instruction 15 minutes a day, maybe that student is going to get 15 minutes of that reading instruction in the morning and 15 minutes in the afternoon. So we've now doubled the amount of frequency and made it more intense. That's what MTSS is supposed to be. I hope that answers your question. And I will say, let me add this real quickly, Kristen. I notice in a lot of public Montessori schools that are required by law to have special education staff, oftentimes the special educators really don't have much understanding at all of Montessori philosophy or pedagogy or how to use the materials. We're not the only ones that need learning, okay? Special educators who are working in a Montessori charter or public school need to learn about Montessori philosophy, pedagogy, and how those materials can be used in a way with what they bring to the table. But the other piece of it is that the role of the special educator is really changing under an inclusion model, where the special educator is working sometimes pushing into the classroom and working with, yes, the identified student, but maybe working with a small group of students in addition to the one who's been identified. And a big role of special educators in Montessori schools or any schools today is consulting and coaching and mentoring the classroom teacher. That's really where the area of expertise of special education is supposed to be shared in the general education classroom.
Someone concluded with their question, how do you balance this? I believe we have to advocate for each type of student in the classroom. So how do we balance?
Well, think about it this way, okay? If you have a group of, let's say 30, you have 30 students, okay? Or 24, you've got 24 students. And of those 24 students, 16 of those students are responding well to the way you're teaching, to the way you're presenting the curriculum, to the social emotional environment of the classroom, and they're thriving and they feel belonging and they've got full access and full participation. Great, wonderful. And then you've got that other group of students. So if you're 24, 16 are doing great. Now you've got your other group, okay? Of those, that's much, much smaller number. Now we can more realistically look at that group of students. Where might students be stuck? What kind of targeted instruction or support with their academic learning and their behavior learning might they need? Okay, so it's not like everybody in the classroom is absolutely getting individual and you're having to give 24 different lessons every single day. That's not what inclusion is. Inclusion is having available the supports that students need. So if, let's say, you've got a student who's generally doing really just fine, progressing, learning, getting along with other students, and an event happens in that student's life, we know that we've got lots and lots and lots of students who have lost a parent or a grandparent. That's going to be a very traumatic event for that student. For a period of time, that student is going to need a different kind of support than the majority of students in your classroom who haven't had that kind of traumatic event. That student is going to need more intentional warmth, attunement, relationship, and that's the support that that student is getting. So we're not talking about, when I say all students, I mean it's available to all students and the supports and the services as needed. It doesn't mean that every student is being seen as a special education student, okay?
Right, let's piggyback on that. So somebody asked, what do you say about ABA therapists asking Montessori guides to follow their techniques in the classroom? Different methods? What is the best compromise for the classroom and the child?
When an ABA therapist is in the classroom, the ABA therapist needs to understand the environment that he or she is in, how that environment works, what the foundational philosophy and pedagogy of that environment is. And it means that, again, it's that collaboration piece. What is it that we could learn from the ABA therapist about how to structure a particular social skill, let's say, with a student? And how do we help the ABA therapist learn how to do that in a Montessori environment? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm working with a situation like that right now, actually, in real life Montessori classroom, where an ABA therapist is going to be coming into the classroom. But before she comes into the classroom, she's going to be doing a lot of work with the classroom teacher so that they are together in a way that provides an integrated approach to working with the student.
So Debbie asked, so how they're trying to examine issues of inclusion based on a child's physical and mental challenges, poverty and low socioeconomic status, and a huge barrier to is a huge barrier to inclusion. And I think you've answered this, but maybe you can touch back on it. So how can Montessori begin to address this?
This is the social justice piece. Okay. How do we as a Montessori community address poverty? More and more Montessori public schools, helping all kinds of families understand the value and the benefit of a Montessori education. There are many families and cultural roots of families that don't see Montessori either as a viable option for what they want for their children, or do they see it as one that they actually want for their child because of these myths about Montessori. So I think again, we keep educating the public. In private Montessori schools, we can work at providing scholarships for people that want to have their child there but can't afford that. That is really it's a different kind of issue. When I think of social justice with my special education hat on, I think that again, if we look at statistics, the highest group of students who are identified as having disabilities is children of color. The highest number of children who are suspended and expelled from school for their behavior, even at the early childhood level, are children of color. That's a problem. And I would hope that that's not a problem that we have in our Montessori schools. But if it is, then addressing that with ABAR training, with, maybe the school needs to set a professional growth and development plan specifically on social justice in Montessori. It's not my area of expertise, but there are lots of people that have that area of expertise in the Montessori community.
Yes, and several people have asked if you could, well, I'm going to say this in a little different way. When you send your slides in for us to distribute, can you please send in also a list of books or articles that people could go to read? Some people have asked, about sharing tools. One person asked here about record keeping for inclusion. You talked about record keeping and like how is that done and what are your suggestions?
That is probably a at least a half day or day-long workshop. Basically, what it means is that we are keeping detailed notes on how a child is responding to the presentations that we're giving. It's called diagnostic teaching, basically, as we're teaching. But you know, these are the kinds of topics that really need to be taught and explored in the Montessori community. It's not really something that I can just say, okay, well, this is how you do it, and then you go off and you do it. It's much more involved than that, really, which is, I know, is not a satisfactory answer. I am putting together the resources that I have mentioned, where I've gotten my data from, and a set of resources of websites and books that you can look at. I can't give you specific tools to use because it fits within the philosophy and the framework and the practice of inclusion. Now, you know, if what you're looking for is like, well, what kind of accommodations could I give to a student that's having difficulties with attention and concentration? You can research that, you can Google that, and tons of stuff will come up. The tricky part is, how do you discriminate which of those tools? And so, you know, people say to me, well, we just need more tools in our toolkit. Yeah, I understand that. But if I don't know when to use a Phillips head screwdriver versus a straight edge screwdriver, or I don't know when to use a wrench rather than pliers, then it's not going to help me accomplish the task I'm trying to accomplish. So that's where some of the professional development that we all need comes in.
Yeah. So could you talk a little more about the tier 3 intervention level? And how would you include a child who needs a high level of support, especially thinking about children whose behavior is quite disruptive?
You know, yes, it's that question gets asked regularly. Supporting a child's behavior in the classroom starts with tier 1 best practices, today's universal best practices. Perhaps this child is having difficulty because there's not the level of predictability and consistency that is needed. Perhaps the student doesn't understand the explicit behavior norms that are expected in this classroom. Perhaps this is a child that has sensory processing issues and is often triggered by internal feeling uncomfortable and unsafe. At tier 3, you would be looking at, I would be looking at completing what's called a functional behavior intervention assessment plan for a child. So you would really look at, what are the specific behaviors to the best of your ability? What are the triggers for those behaviors? How do we reduce those triggers? How do we provide universal best practices, such as, you know, the predictable and consistent environment? How do we help that child feel a sense of belonging? I will say that it is extraordinarily rare that a child is going to have significant behavior problems and not also have significant academic issues as well. They go hand in hand. A child who is not doing well academically as they are comparing themselves to their peers is going to act out. They're going to have behavior issues. And vice versa, a child that's got, maybe a child's got some sensory issues that are making it difficult for that child to feel comfortable in their body long enough to sustain attention to learn, they're going to have learning difficulties. So it means looking at the whole child. And what I didn't say, and I should have, so I'm glad you asked this question. When a school implements a multi-tiered system of support, there is a team, there's an MTS team of people that works together. I have been a member of those teams at smaller private Montessori schools that wanted to have an MTSS, but they don't have a special educator on staff. They don't have a behavior interventionist on staff. So I have been called in as to be part of that team. And when we really look at, with a very, very close inquiry observation, what kinds of difficulties is the student having across settings, then together the team comes and develops an intervention plan that, again, is based on prevention of those disruptive behaviors rather than always reacting to those negative behaviors. Every time we give attention to a student for their negative behavior, we're actually reinforcing, we're making that negative behavior stronger. So it's really to everyone's advantage if we can look at this with the lens of how do I prevent these behaviors by helping this child feel successful and belonging, and addressing what are the triggers that are resulting in this disruptive behavior. But again, it's an individual, you would come up with an individual intervention plan for that child that would involve the general education teacher, the associate assistant teacher. It might involve an OT coming in to give the child some sensory input.
So Barb's asking, do you know which states fully implement MTSS? And do states get to decide what they will approve of with the MTSS?
What I am seeing is that most states are bumping it down to the district, and districts are determining what their MTSS is going to look like. Now, if you're in a Montessori charter school and you are considered an LEA, a local education agency or whatever, I forget what the A stands for, then you can design your own MTSS. If you're in a private Montessori school, of course, you can design your own MTSS, and it's got nothing to do with the state. It depends on the state you're in, depends on the district you're in. But even if you have a district mandated MTSS, as a Montessori school, you can look at that mandated MTSS through the lens of Montessori. There's a way to do that. It's bridging. It's how do we bridge Montessori philosophy and pedagogy with district requirements? In the same way that we would look at, like a lot of states don't have Common Core anymore, but if your state does, how would you align Montessori curriculum with Common Core? Well, we just bridge it, right? We can do that.
So Barbara Laborsky said that in her Q&A, she said, NCMPS has a book with great tools, such as guided observation in preschool, for example, plus more. Barbara was in session 1 presenting, so I just want to send that out. And then Elizabeth, in tying this up, Christine, so much information. We are also very grateful. Is there a certain type of training that you recommend for programs and staff, to take to learn more about specific tools for running an inclusive classroom?
One of the things that I do is to customize professional development for schools that want to become intentionally inclusive. And that is the work I do. You see my email is here. It starts with surveying the same thing I would do with students. What does your staff already know? And what does your staff need to know? And then we look at how do we present that professional development that will support that growth. I don't know of any program for classroom teachers or teacher trainers that specifically aligns current best practice in the field of special education with Montessori, but I will tell you that it's a program that I've been working on for the past 12 months with a syllabus, with a set of competencies, and developing the coursework that would go along with that. And hopefully one of these days, that will be something that could be provided to a cohort of currently credentialed Montessori teachers, as well as teacher trainers, or maybe even included to a degree in teacher education programs. because it's an urgent need.
Yes. Well, we can't thank you enough for your time today. And I will be the spokesperson for all those that have attended. And we had a nice crowd today. And thank you all for your questions. If they weren't answered, you do have Christine's email address here. So please do, she's open to having you write to her. And I can say thank you so much for this content. It was very inspiring, and we are very happy to have had you here as our
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it, Rebecca.
Thank you.